This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're picking up a conversation we started previously, a philosophical epic, really. It was about how the Islamic intellectual world handled just the overwhelming rational power of Aristotle.
A huge challenge for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you were with us then, you heard a story of, rapid adoption, intense conflict between philosophy and theology. There were figures like Ghazali who just fundamentally rejected it, and then eventually institutional exclusion.
And that narrative, which sort of culminates around the time of Averroes, it often leads to this very common, it's just an inaccurate assumption.
With that?
Most people believe that when the Islamic world decided to, let's say, sideline Greek rationalism, Europe just stepped right in.
Right. Picked up the baton and ran with it.
Picked up the philosophy and smoothly sailed into the later medieval period and the Renaissance.
That's the easy version you get in, like an intro course. One civilization discards it, the other embraces it.
Yeah.
Simple.
And that idea is profoundly misleading. Today's mission for you, the listener, is to understand the sheer historical agony and the chronological complexity of Europe's process.
Okay.
We are talking about a tumultuous intellectual roller coaster ride, a ride of acceptance and rejection that didn't take decades, but centuries. A 600-year struggle just to fully digest Aristotle's system.
A 600-year struggle. Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to trace this timeline. Why Europe was actually more hostile at first than the Islamic world, how these ideas almost tore apart their brand new universities, and the ultimate deeply ironic role Aristotle played in setting the stage for the scientific revolution.
So we have to start at the beginning for Europe.
Okay.
And that starting line was a place of deep hostility, profound hostility, actually. When Greek philosophy first showed up centuries earlier, the early church fathers were vehemently against it.
We always hear them railing against pagan influence, but what was the real threat? I mean, why not just treat Plato as ancient history?
They saw it as a genuine intellectual danger. Tertullian has that famous line, right? What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?
Yes.
He viewed it all as pagan poison. But Aristotle was uniquely dangerous because his system was so complete. His logic, his physics, they provided this self-contained way to understand the universe without needing revelation at all.
And the biggest ticking bomb inside that system was his world eternal theory.
Precisely. If you accept Aristotle's logic, the cosmos is eternal. It has always existed, governed by its own rules. This directly, and I mean directly, contradicts the foundational Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo.
Creation out of nothing.
At a specific moment in time, if the world is eternal, there is no moment of creation. The whole idea of a personal intervening God who creates is it's radically undercut.
This isn't just a small theological debate. It attacks the very identity of God in Christianity.
It absolutely does. And the result was an intense, swift religious prohibition. For the first few centuries, Aristotle was, for all intents and purposes, banned in Europe. And that tells us something really important.
What's that?
That early Western thought was, in its first impulse, actually more exclusionary and more fearful of this philosophy than the Islamic world had been when it first found the same texts.
But, history doesn't stop for bans. So this brings us to the 12th and 13th centuries, which is when the intellectual dam just breaks.
It really does. This is the shock of reintroduction.
Aristotle's back. But he's not alone this time.
He is not. The translation movements, especially in places like Toledo in Spain and Sicily, they bring his advanced texts, the physics, the metaphysics, back into Europe. But critically, these were not just Greek texts anymore.
They'd been worked on.
They were texts that had been studied, commented on, and intellectually, refined by the Islamic intellectual world for centuries.
So Europe was getting an Islam-style reinterpretation, as you put it.
Exactly. It was a pre-packaged, highly advanced, and therefore potentially volatile intellectual product. They got Avicenna's highly theologized versions.
The ones that tried to make it all fit together.
And then they got the far more radical, pure rationalism of Averroes. So for a European scholar, this wasn't just an old Greek philosophy. It was a potent system, shaped and amplified by a rival civilization. It was seen as a dangerous object.
I can see the panic setting in. If this intellectual payload was strong enough to cause huge rifts in the Abbasid Caliphate, then that same threat was now knocking on the door of the University of Paris.
And panic was the response. The University of Paris was the intellectual capital of the West, and their reaction was immediate. It was harsh. They banned the teaching of Aristotle's most important works, his Physics and Metaphysics, in 1210 and then again in 1215.
So beyond the eternal world theory, what other specific points really pushed them to such an extreme measure?
Okay, so there were three critical points that threatened everything. One, the world eternal theory. We've covered that. The second was this reading of Aristotle that suggested the human soul, the intellect, was shared among all humans, that Aristotle didn't argue for individual personal immortality.
Hang on, let's clarify that for the listener. Why is that so incredibly dangerous?
Because if the intellect is universal, a shared spiritual thing rather than your unique soul, then you, your personal self, with all your memories and sins and good deeds, you don't go to heaven or hell. The idea of personal resurrection, accountability, the whole moral structure of Christianity just collapses.
That's a direct threat to the very idea of salvation.
Absolutely. And the third was Aristotle's God, the unmoved mover. This God is an impersonal, abstract thing. It only moves the universe by being an object of love, like a magnet. It doesn't actively intervene, it doesn't answer prayers, it doesn't give commandments.
Which is the polar opposite of the personal covenant-making God of Christianity.
Exactly. But institutions ban things, and students find a way to read them. The bans worked for a moment, but the intellectual curiosity was just too strong.
And this is where the chaos of the 13th century really kicks in, the rise of what we call Latin Averroism.
Precisely. You have to try and capture the atmosphere here. Imagine being a young theology student in Paris, reading these prohibited texts smuggled in from Spain, and realizing that Aristotle's logic, with Averroes' commentary, it offers a completely self-consistent, rational worldview.
A worldview that proves your professor's theology is, scientifically speaking, wrong.
That's the radicalization. That is what led to Latin Averroism.
So what were their core beliefs? The really radical ones.
They adopted the most extreme position of Averroes. They basically argued for the double truth theory, a concept the church absolutely hated.
Which says?
It says something can be true philosophically, you can prove it with reason, while something else is true religiously through revelation. But in practice, what it really meant was
Philosophy is the real truth.
philosophy is objective, rational truth. Religion is just allegory, metaphor. It's meant for social order and to keep the uneducated masses in line.
That is pure intellectual dynamite for the church. So why didn't they just exile philosophy wholesale? Just get rid of it like what happened in parts of the Islamic world?
Because the sheer explanatory power of Aristotle was irreplaceable. They had no other systematic science. Their choice was either having no cosmological explanation for the world or finding a way to integrate the only one available. The rationalists really forced their hand.
And the crisis peaked with the church's final big attempt to lay down the law.
Yes, the climax. The great interdictions of 1270 and especially 1277. These were massive systemic condemnations. They banned 219 specific Aristotelian and Averroist ideas.
Wow.
They explicitly banned the eternal world, doctrines denying the individual soul, and issued the strongest possible warnings against double truth. Europe, just like the Islamic world a century before, was right on the very brink of institutional philosophical exclusion. And this brings us to the Great Divergence. Both civilizations faced the exact same threat, radical rationalism undermining their core theology. But here, the paths separated.
Right. The Islamic world, broadly speaking, chose opposition, leading to the institutional exclusion of philosophy. The Christian world, however, it chose integration, largely thanks to one man, Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas, who was active right around the time of those interdictions, he undertook this just gigantic and at the time very controversial project.
To reconcile Aristotle with Christian theology.
To reconcile the uncompromising rationalism of Aristotle with Christian creative theology. He wasn't just a scholar, he was a theological revolutionary.
How did he even do that? I mean, perform this impossible synthesis without being condemned himself.
He was a brilliant purifier. He didn't just accept Aristotle. He Christianized him, for instance. He took Avicenna's idea of the necessary being and adapted it as the concept of God.
Okay.
But at the same time, he fiercely criticized Averroes' radical view of a single shared intellect, which was the key move to secure the existence of the individual immortal soul.
The thing that was so important for the church.
The absolute deal breaker. So he created this stable system where theology didn't just coexist with philosophy, it absorbed it, it mastered it.
So he used Aristotle's logic as a tool, not as the master.
Exactly. He separated philosophy What reason can know on its own from theology, what must be known by faith. He forced the pagan philosophy to be entirely remodeled to fit the Christian story. The key difference was the method of defense. Exclusion versus assimilation.
Now we get to the part of the story that just blows my mind, the scale of this struggle, the 600-year delay. So Aquinas completes this revolutionary synthesis in the 1270s. He resolves the crisis. You'd assume the church would just immediately adopt the solution.
You'd think so. Far from it. This is what I call the 300 plus 300 problem.
Okay.
Despite his intellectual genius, Aquinas was seen as a dangerous, radical figure by many of his contemporaries. He was directly opposed by powerful, entrenched groups, especially the Franciscans, led by Bonaventure. They held on to the older Augustinian, Neoplatonic framework.
So the revolution happened in one man's head, but the institution, it wasn't ready to change his whole diet.
That's a perfect way to put it. The mainstream theology hadn't strengthened its stomach enough to digest it. For 2 full centuries after Aquinas' death, anti-Thomistic movements were often dominant. You see the rise of movements like Ockhamism.
You mentioned Ockhamism. Can you just quickly remind us what that movement criticized in Aquinas?
Absolutely. Ockhamism, which was hugely popular in the 14th and 15th centuries, was basically a critique that Aquinas had made God too predictable, too constrained by human reason. Occamists prioritized God's absolute boundless freedom. If Aquinas said faith and reason fit together neatly, Occamists said no, God is entirely free from human logic. So they actually pushed faith and reason further apart again. Aquinas remained a minority view for a very long time.
This timeline is just staggering. When did the institution finally catch up?
It took centuries. The first real institutional nod came in 1567. Pope Pius V declared him a doctor of the church. That's high praise, but it didn't mandate his teaching.
So we are 300 years after his death, and he's still just one option on the menu.
He is the true global institutional implementation. The point where Aristotle, in his Christianized form, became the mandatory philosophical backbone of the Catholic Church, that did not happen until 1879.
1879. That is nearly 600 years after Aquinas.
It was Pope Leo XIII's encyclical, Aeterni Patris. It explicitly mandated that all Catholic theological education must be centered on Aquinas. That's the moment he effectively became official Catholic philosophy.
Wow.
His whole system, natural law, the proofs for God's existence, it was finally solidified as the standard Catholic worldview.
So if the Islamic world took maybe 50 years to institutionally exclude Aristotle, it took the Catholic Church 600 years to fully accept and implement the Christianized version. The sheer scale of the West's resistance and its slow, grinding assimilation, that's the real story here.
And this brings us to the ultimate, just astonishing irony of this whole 600-year struggle.
Okay, I'm ready. If the West spent centuries carefully integrating and Christianizing Aristotle, surely that integration led to the scientific revolution. That's the payoff, right?
Absolutely not. This is the crucial counterintuitive point. The scientific revolution was born from the direct rejection and destruction of Aristotelian natural philosophy.
Wait, what?
For Galileo, for Kepler, for Newton. The 1,000-year-old Aristotelian physics they had inherited was the primary intellectual enemy.
But how was his physics an enemy?
Because it was fundamentally anti-experimental. Aristotle's physics said objects have these intrinsic tendencies, these final causes or purposes that drive their movement. It said that motion stops unless it's being pushed. And it said that there were totally different laws for the heavens and for the earth.
Right.
Galileo and Newton had to throw all of that out. They had to discard final causes, unify the laws of heaven and earth, and prove that mathematics, not qualitative logic, was the language of nature.
And here's the crazy unintentional consequence of what Aquinas did. By embedding Aristotle's cosmology into theology, he accidentally made it harder to question.
Exactly. When you make geocentrism and the split between heaven and earth part of your stable theological system, you unintentionally fix those ideas as theologically guaranteed truth. Criticizing the physics becomes like criticizing God's order. That integration arguably slowed down science, at least initially.
So the scientific pioneers succeeded by actively denying the very premises that the church had just spent 600 years fighting to integrate.
The scientific act was negation. It was the funeral of Aristotelian natural philosophy.
So if it wasn't Aristotelian, what philosophy did the scientific revolution draw on?
Fundamentally, it was the victory of the Platonic spirit. Not so much theological Platonism, but the focus on mathematical structure, on abstract form, and universal quantifiable laws. It's the exact opposite of Aristotle's qualitative, purpose-driven physics.
So Aristotle gave them a premise.
He gave them the premise that God's order is logically understandable, but the negation of his actual science is what birthed modern science.
So what does this entire, long, complex story mean for you, the learner? It means we have to stop casually saying the West just picked up Aristotle. The critical difference between the Islamic world and the West wasn't acceptance versus rejection. It was the speed and the method of institutional defense.
Both great civilizations were desperately trying to protect their core theological stability. The Islamic world possessed the intellectual and political cohesiveness to refuse the philosophy quickly and protect its social unity.
Whereas the West?
The West undertook a gigantic, centuries-long religious restructuring, risking all sorts of internal chaos to slowly swallow and assimilate the philosophy.
And the true irony is that the institutional delay, that 600 years of debate and opposition, unintentionally created the intellectual space they needed. By the time Aristotle was finally officially cemented as sacred truth by the Church in the late 19th century.
The scientific community had already had 300 years to bury his physics and move on.
It's incredible.
Which raises an important question for you to consider. If the West had possessed the consensus to accept Aquinas immediately back in the 13th century, if it had solidified Aristotelian physics as sacred truth 600 years earlier, would the intellectual space for Galileo to reject Aristotle have ever opened up? Or did that slow, painful institutional resistance ultimately save science from itself?
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.